Enable IPD workflow for a particular facility. IPD workflow can be enabled by the admin from the organization settings. Let me log in as an admin. Once logged in, you need to navigate to the organization settings and then to the organization setup under the general on the left side menu. Now scroll to the particular facility for which the IPD workflow is to be enabled and click on the edit button on the right side. Now we need to navigate to the fourth step, that is facility settings, and click yes against the enable IPD workflow option. Once done, click on the save button. Please note that IPD clinical workflow is disabled for a facility by default and has to be enabled manually for each facility. Schedule admission. Let us log in as a counselor and schedule admission of a patient who has been advised surgery. This patient has been transferred to the counselor. Schedule the admission by clicking on the schedule admission button on the right side of the patient details. In the schedule admission form, the admission creator, in this case the counselor, can change the admission type. The default admission type is planned. You can also select emergency or same day. In both these cases, the admission date gets fixed to the current date and cannot be changed, whereas in the case of planned admission, the date will be selected next to 4 days automatically, but this can be changed as required. Now let us view the case details. Select the applicable procedure from the admission and create admission by clicking on this button. The admission has been created successfully. Now let us jump to the admission of this patient by clicking on this button. This will navigate us into the IPD to the date on which the admission was scheduled. IPD workflow updates on the left hand side in the patients list. If the clinical workflow is enabled, each patient in the IPD will show additional information on the left side. These are tags, milestone and stages based on the admission type and current patient journey in the list view. Tags will help the user to understand whether the patient has been admitted with cashless status and what was the admission type. For example, in this case, the patient has opted for cashless hospitalization and the admission was planned, signified by the acronym PD. Similarly, it could be SD for same day and ER for emergency. Another feature introduced is milestones. Each major iteration in patient's IPD journey is captured using milestones. This starts from scheduling admission to patient admitted to OT schedule and so on. The last stage being patient discharged. Stages. Stages give a high level picture as to where the patient is currently in their journey. The 6 possible stages in the patient's journey are pre-admission, pre-operative, intraoperative, post-operative, pre-discharge and post-discharge. Each of these stages will be represented on the left hand side against the patient in the list view. IPD workflow updates. Patient details on the right hand side. Introducing patient forward feature. New patient forward feature has been introduced in the IPD. This feature works similar to what we already have in the OPD. A patient can be forwarded by selecting a user. The counselor has scheduled admission for this particular patient and he is now ready for admission. Now the counselor can forward the patient to anyone who is designated to admit the patient, say for example nurse. Every time you forward a patient, you will need to mention a message for the person to whom the patient is being forwarded to. This is mandatory. Once the patient is sent to the nurse, it will be reflected in the workflow. Counselor will have the option to undo and get the patient back to his queue if required. Now let us log in as the nurse to whom the patient was forwarded and navigate to the IPD to view patient details. The message from the counselor who forwarded the patient is reflected here. This nurse will be responsible to mark the patient as ready for admission after completing the fitness check, clearing the bill, etc. Once the patient is marked as ready for admission, it can again be forwarded to someone who is responsible to admit the patient. For the sake of this example, we will let the current nurse admit the patient by clicking on Admit Patient button on the right side. Now the patient is admitted and next milestone can be updated as ready for OT. Upon clicking the Ready for OT button, the user is again asked to forward the patient to another user, say OT nurse, who could schedule the OT for the patient and engage the OT from the OT department as shown here. There will be an option to unlink the OT as well. The milestone OT engaged will be updated upon clicking this button and reflected against the patient. It is during this stage that the intraoperative details such as OT checklist, operative note, etc. can be captured. Once OT is completed, the user can mark it as done. Next, the option to send the patient to ward will appear. User can either do it themselves or assign it to some other user, say a ward nurse, who is responsible to do this along with a message. Let's log in as a nurse who has the patient in the ward and can conclude the final milestone of discharging the patient. Once all the required notes are filled, such as clinical, operative, and discharge notes, the patient will automatically be marked as ready for discharge. Operative notes should ideally be filled at the intraoperative stage. Now the patient can be discharged by clicking on this button. User will need to make sure that all the prerequisites of discharging a patient are met. These are reflected with check marks here. The patient has now been marked as discharged and workflow has been completed. Please note that it is not mandatory to engage in OT and patient can be discharged at any stage.